Oh, there you
Good
go.
afternoon. Welcome, STEMsational students, to our STEM Friday. We have a new ambassador joining us tonight. Miss Aish is a PhD candidate in electrical and computer engineering at Georgia Tech, largely interested in characterizing learning and intelligence in artificial and biological systems. Towards these ends, she spends her time studying both machine learning and theological neuroscience with a healthy smaltering of many topics in applied mathematics. Outside of academic and scientific pursuits, her interests include reading, classical music, racket sports, cool movies, and TV shows, and solving every Rubik's Cube variant she can get her hands on. Aish is incredibly fond of cats and enjoys history of any kind, still identifies as an ardent Federer fan, and remains a Bombay kid at heart for life. I am going to hand over the mic to our newest ambassador, Miss Aish.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I would have given you a shorter bio had I known you were going to read it out loud. But yeah, I'm Aish. I study electrical and computer engineering, but I started studying the brain at some point, and it's been very fun doing that. I largely use mathematics and computers to try and understand the brain. And so what I'll be talking about today is also along those lines, where I'll be speaking about how we try coming up with, pen and paper or computer models of brain function and things we can do along those lines. So just give me a second, I'll share my screen. And I think we should be able to see my slides now. So yeah, towards my PhD studies, what I work on is theoretical and computational neuroscience. So before we go down that route, it's usually worthwhile asking what exactly neuroscience is more broadly. And neuro really is just the study of the brain and nervous system in itself. This sounds easy enough. We all have brains, we all have nervous systems, so we should be able to understand what's happening inside of them. But it turns out that it's not as easy, because actually trying to understand this is a really interdisciplinary task and requires you to combine a lot of different fields of science, math, and also engineering, where, we're normally accustomed to thinking of biology the minute we think about any body part that we have. But given that this body part actually controls what all your other body parts do, it becomes incredibly important to understand exactly how it functions and, what exactly the outputs are given particular inputs. The notion of how the brain in itself, like this muscle mass, actually gives rise to everything that you think and do and behave, and what exactly the chemistry is also, in terms of what are the different atoms and molecules that are responsible for these different behaviors. And God forbid, if something actually happens to your brain, or if you fall sick, you need to then look into the medical aspects of things. And also, if it ever comes down to it, if you feel the need to replace a part of your brain because of an accident or something of that sort, you then need engineers to come up with good prosthetic devices and things like that. So all in all, it ends up being a very, very complicated task. And as a matter of fact, it's worth noting that the human brain in itself has about 100 billion neurons. A billion is one followed by 9 zeros. And so you have 100 billion of those tiny little cells inside your brain. You have 100 trillion synapses. So each neuron, and every neuron is sort of the smallest unit of computation in your brain. Each neuron tends to have about 1,000 connections to like different neurons inside your brain. And really this, if you look at it in terms of how many stars there are in the Milky Way, there's an estimated 200 to 4 billion stars in the Milky Way. And so then just between two humans, you have approximately as many neurons. So trying to understand or make sense of exactly what's happening with the brain is in many ways as complicated as trying to understand what's happening in the skies and in the universe. And so like most things go, we have a long and rich history in neuroscience, and unsurprisingly, a lot of it starts in ancient Greece. In particular, I'm going to show you two important people. I believe this dude was called like Almenian of Creton or something, but he was the first guy, and this was 520 before Common Era, that for the first time someone postulated that it's not the heart that controls all the other organs in your body, but the brain. Nowadays, it seems quite obvious to us because we've grown up hearing or listening to the fact that the brain is responsible for all the different functions in your body. But back then, everyone thought it was the heart that actually did all of it. And so the first time someone even suggested something different, it created quite an uproar. And then there's this guy called Galvani, who was very fond of dissecting different animals and was one of the first people to show that there are different types of neurons inside the brain. So it's not just one particular type of neuron that does everything, but depending on where in the brain you are and what function that particular brain part of the brain is doing, you need different types of neurons. We then go to post-Renaissance Europe, so about 1870, 1880, and this was the first time people could conclusively show that giving electric shocks to different parts of the brain could actually simulate movement in different limbs of the animal. I believe the earliest experiments that were done along these lines were done on frogs, and not in a slightly different way, but sort of related. This led to conclusive studies that different brain areas actually have different functions and affect different parts of your body depending on how they're connected. And so over here we have two very popular scientists, Wernicke and Broca. So if you've ever heard of the Wernicke and Broca areas, both of them are very pivotal or important for language. They were the first ones to sort of conclusively show how these different areas have developed so that they control different functions and different aspects of the human body. And sort of finally, in the historical sense, we had our first Nobel Prize in 1906, or the first Nobel Prize for neuroscience was given in 1906, and it was given for the discovery of the neuron to Golgi and Ramon y Cajal, two big giants in the field of neuroscience. And since then, so since 1906, there have been 11 prizes in total that have gone to neuroscience. Most recently in 2014. They've gone at approximately 10-ish years between prizes. So maybe we'll have another one soon enough. So the brain is complicated and it's responsible for a lot of different things that we do, which also sort of implies that there are many different subfields in neuroscience. And some of the most popular divisions include, for one, cellular and molecular. So trying to understand exactly what the different cells in your brains do from just a very mechanistic perspective, and trying to understand what molecules are important. So how much potassium goes in or leaves the cell for different spikes to be generated, things along those lines. Then on a more higher level of abstraction that perhaps we are more accustomed to thinking of, you have cognitive and behavioral neuroscience, which essentially corresponds to how are different behaviors a result of different inputs or stimuli. You have neuroengineering, which is what a lot of people often think of when they think of trying to do something with neuroscience. Having prosthetics and being able to move a finger given particular using particular electrical stimuli or electrode arrays, and being able to decode from brain signals what the person wants to do. And then you, of course, also have more very broadly the study of neuroanatomy or neurophysiology, which quite literally looks into what are the different types of cells in the brain, what are the different pathways inside of the brain, how they connect to all the different parts of the nervous system, so on and so forth. Having spoken about all of that, I'm now sort of going to talk about what computational and theoretical neuroscience is. And the first thing to bear in mind is that this is perhaps a more exploratory field of neuroscience, and it's not so clinically translational or relevant. But the reason why it's really important is because it gives you a way of integrating and synthesizing knowledge across the different levels of abstraction that we saw before. And so, as with any theoretical field, really, the crux of theoretical or computational neuroscience is to have good models and be able to tell conclusively what, how, or why certain things happen, and to be able to generate hypotheses and answer and sort of combine fields such as, say, neurobiology and psychology in terms of models, and be able to conclusively say that these particular parts of the brain are responsible for this particular behavior that we see in person A, given some particular inputs or situations. And to do this, you largely use the language of mathematics, just like how physicists use math to describe how the world works, neuroscientists use math to describe how the brain works. And you really just want to be able to do this from first principles. And so, we often use different types of simulations. So nowadays, just given how much computational powers our computers have, you sort of can simulate almost any input and any output that you can think of. Machine learning is largely becoming more and more popular, not only to replicate how brains behave. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of or used and played around with ChatGPT at this point, but deep neural networks are also used as models of the brain, and I'll talk a little about that a little later. And then you use good old statistics also to do a lot of this sort of understanding. Perhaps what is most important about the field in general is to note that even though these things are not very clinically translational, they play a very important role in generating and validating hypotheses for more practical areas of neuroscience. So for example, if you're actually trying to develop a prosthetic arm for a patient who's lost their arm, you want to be able to conclusively say which circuit of the brain is responsible for sending signals that allow you to pick something up, grasp it with your fingers, and like move your arm again and put it down. And without having a first principles understanding of how the brain works, it is impossible to actually come up with the devices or build devices that will help you achieve these even very simple tasks or behaviors. I'm so sorry. But yeah, this brings us to the different models that we have in neuroscience. Just give me a second. I seem to have a bad cold. All right, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so the different models that you have in neuroscience. Oh Lord. The three real different types of models that you could have, very broadly speaking. The first are descriptive models, which try answering the question what. So what external inputs do the different neurons in your brains respond to, and what information it is that they store. The second is mechanistic. So these sort of models try to answer the question how. So how do we simulate different types of behaviors? How do we simulate the behavior of one single neuron? How do we simulate the behavior of tens of neurons, thousands of neurons, or even billions of neurons? And finally, you have what are known as interpretive or normative models, which try answering the question why. So why do different circuits operate the way they do? Is it because of different inputs? Is it because of different types of neurons, so on and so forth? And what are the computational principles that underlie their operation? So yeah, those broadly are the types of models that you have in computational neuroscience. Having said that, perhaps what is one of the most famous models ever in computational biology largely is this thing called the Hodgkin-Huxley model, which, and this is a model, right? So this isn't exactly how things work, but it gives you a good enough sense for how a certain spike might be generated given the inputs that you have to your different cells. And the really cool thing is that even though it describes things in terms of capacitances, which are these two parallel lines that you see often, and resistances, um, it uses these like electrical components to sort of then tell you how the brain might work on a very, very mechanistic level. And another like fun thing to note is that the Hodgkin-Huxley model's also now been many years since, but been adapted to trying to understand the contraction and expansions of your heart. And so in general, what is important to sort of take away is that models that might arise in one field often find use in other fields as well. So the Hodgkin-Huxley is a very simple model. Like you can see, it makes use of some very simple electrical components. Perhaps a slightly more sophisticated model in some sense, again, for just spike generation. But now in the case of two interconnected neurons is what is known as the leaky integrate and fire model. And so again, the basic components largely remain the same, but the added level of complexity here becomes that you make the model slightly noisier, and by doing so, you then allow the model to behave in slightly more different ways than you would with just something like the Hodgkin-Huxley model, which assumes very clean inputs and things like that. So both of those are models of just one or a couple of neurons at best. But what becomes more important then, or remains unaddressed, is how exactly different networks of neurons might behave. So in this case, the two circles sort of correspond to not one neuron each, but like a population of neurons. And you have different connectivity measures and different currents or weights being connected across them. And what you sort of want to take away from here is that depending on the inputs that you have, and given the different transition probabilities that you have between these different populations of neurons, you can then generate a lot of cool looking patterns, which essentially would correspond to different behaviors. So very often what computational neuroscientists like doing is seeing the patterns or the outputs generated by networks of neurons, and then associating these different patterns with the different kinds of behaviors. And finally, what is perhaps most popular nowadays are these models known as deep neural networks. Now, a bunch of you might have already heard of them or seen them in different contexts, but there are these networks called convolutional neural networks, which were first proposed in the late 1990s. And when they were proposed as a method of trying to process visual inputs like how humans or even other mammals sort of do. And now, given the progress that we've made with them, what we find is that these models do a very, very good job of not only replicating the function of visual processing in the human brain, but they also do a fantastic job of being able to take in different other types of signals or recordings from the brain. In this particular case, these are called fMRI responses. So that's functional magnetic recordings, if people are aware of them. And then decoding them to sort of tell you what exactly it is that the person was looking at. So that's very, very cool and very, very important in a lot of different ways, especially if you think about how one could potentially replace functioning in the event of an accident or something, where if you end up hurting one part of your brain, you'd still be able to record from other parts of your brain which still work, and using those recordings be able to estimate what the function of this other part of the brain would have been, which is now hurt because of an accident, for example, and be able to pass on those signals to a prosthetic to help replace function in whatever way possible. But, having said all of that, there's a lot that is still really not understood, and a lot of work that needs to be done in many different areas. And so, all these models are simple and they're useful, but at the end of the day, because of the simplifications that we need to make because, there's only so much math or computation that we've been able to do thus far, all our models are wrong, albeit, very useful at times. There's a lot of work to be done in understanding population level activity, which is essentially how different neurons interact with each other and how they give rise to different kinds of behaviors. And along those lines, we still don't understand how deep neural networks work, because they're largely inspired by the brain, and they've given us a way now of replicating a lot of brain level activity to some extent. But because of the added complexity that you have, we don't really understand what's happening in those models, even though we are able to replicate behaviors. And so being able to understand population level activity would mean making a lot of progress for both the machine learning and the computational neuroscience communities. And the hope really is that all of this progress would lead to more effective AI systems, which, currently the AI systems that do as well as they do or are popular require a lot of training, and a lot of data needs to be fed to them. which isn't the case with humans. Humans don't need to see 1,000 images of a tree to be able to call the 1,001st image a tree. But that's just how our current AI systems work. Yeah, progress would also be in better prosthetics and cures for neurodegenerative diseases, or being able to replace function in terms of in cases of accidents and things like that. Having said all that, yeah, that's like a largely quick overview of what computational or theoretical neuroscience is, or just what neuroscience is in general, I suppose. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions or take any comments, or just hear what people have to say and things like that. And sorry for the coughing fit. Yep, I'm going to stop sharing now.
That it's don't worry about it. I did that all last week, and
Yeah, I don't know.
so I was like, okay, I just have to stop and wait. So, but I did have a question regarding computational modeling for traumatic brain injuries. How is that work in that area?
So just like concussions and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, it's so I study at Georgia Tech, so I'm in Atlanta, so I do know that there are a few professors who work with the Atlanta Falcons actually on things like that. Um, but having said that, TBIs are probably one of the hardest or least understood, neurodegenerative diseases in some ways, because they lead to a lot of progressive injury, and they also seem to affect a lot of the adjoining areas quite often. So yeah, they're really not understood. It's not as, in some ways, as easy as trying to replace function in case of a more directed accident where a particular area just loses its
I see.
function.
Like strokes, or like frontal lobe injuries or something like that, like strokes and
Yeah, because those tend to be a lot more localized, and even with things like well, there's no cure for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and things like that, but even with those, I think there's been progress in helping slow down some of it to some extent. But with TBIs, partly also because very often they're repetitive in nature or they occur over time, they've really not been understood at all. And yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in those areas.
okay, at least it's do you know if it's a lot of studying still in that area? So I
Yeah,
suppose, yeah, if the professors are working with the Falcons, and
yeah, there's definitely a lot of, you know, research is active and there's money towards it. There's definitely a lot of money in that area. I know that the NFL themselves seem to be investing quite a bit in it. And so there's definitely a lot of people looking into those things, but unfortunately, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done before we really have a good handle on these things. And I think as of now, prevention is the best cure,
yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah, because I always often wonder if it was even pre-NFL, because a lot of kids come from like Pop Warner, or,
Mm-hmm.
leagues and everything, and I'm wondering if something like that, if they even have models for kids, for when they get to
Unfortunately, all of our models right now are with like mice and
oh.
chimps at
Yeah,
best.
yeah.
It's only in the past like 20-ish years that people have really started even understanding just how dangerous these sorts of um, injuries are, because
Right.
you don't see them very often until it's like 20 years down the line.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
yeah, no, unfortunately, a lot of the work that's being done is still very, very nascent, very young, or like baby stages in terms of research. Yeah, things are still being studied in mice and lower organisms compared to what humans are. Yeah.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions? You can chat. You could write them in the chat also. I may have another question, but I have to plug in my laptop because the plug came
Right.
loose. So just 1 second here. So in your field, kind of give the kids, because I have some kids, they're in some sports, so that's why we record these, because Fridays, it's really hard to catch all of them, especially now that it's towards the end of school. There's a lot of things going on. So some of them want to know what kind of studies, what's the best school for this type of study, and what kind of classes they need to take. So if you can just kind of outline those, that would be nice.
So best schools is a very, very hard question to answer,
Yeah.
especially
Where you go.
yeah. But what kind of classes do you take is easier. But best schools, I think it really depends on what you want to do, because also it's so interdisciplinary. You can choose to become a doctor and study these things. You could choose to become a scientist and study these things. So depending on what your chosen field is, try going to the best school you can, given the resources, all that. Best school is just like a ridiculous question to answer.
Right.
But in terms of studying, if you're in high school, you definitely want to, do the holy grail sort of of science, right? So like physics, chemistry, math, biology. Try doing as much of them as one can, and then deciding what you like amongst them. If you find that you're more inclined towards physics and mechanics and things along those lines, perhaps some form of neuroengineering might be well suited to your interests. If you find biology or cognitive science is what you're more inclined towards, you might then want to study or take classes in more along the lines of chemistry, biology, potentially becoming a doctor or a psychiatrist, or even a neurologist or a neurosurgeon. If one finds that they really enjoy math and computers and robotics and things along those lines, then again, things which are more in the intersection of, say, artificial intelligence and neuroscience sort of become a nice option. And in that case, you want to spend time learning how to write code so that you can run up simulations really quickly. And then also you want to be able to do math so that you can sort of write formally exactly what it is that your models are doing. So yeah, really take all the physics, math, and science chem bio classes you can when you're younger on, and then depending on what you like, I guess one can choose either to do pure sciences research in chemistry or molecular biology, or something more applied that uses engineering and computer science, or one can always become a doctor if one wants to really,
Take that.
try and help as many people as possible in person. Yeah.
And I know a couple of these students, and I know the questions that they would ask you. I know one person, Sophia, would ask, what is your favorite part of your studies, and if you have participated in any projects?
So I've had the chance to participate in a bunch of projects. My favorite part maybe of these things would be writing things down in code. So writing down the program, having it learn from data, and then actually seeing a small robot or something do exactly what a human would do in that particular situation. I think that is very, very satisfying to see. So I'm also from the more computational part of things. But then I also have friends who led some prosthetic studies, and they've actually seen their code being used in a way where they find that a person who could not lift a finger is now able to lift a water bottle and, you know, drink water on their own. So yeah, that's one of the coolest things about neuroscience, is that you know, if you do it long enough and you work at it hard enough, chances are you'll have the opportunity to be a part of a big project at some point that actually helps people out, and those things are just very, very satisfying. Yeah.
Right. And I know this is a an issue that's gone on for many, many years, but autism, how how does that play into your studies?
I personally haven't had a chance to look into the spectrum at all, but from what I understand, that would often imply different models. And so, from the very basic level, that would mean getting a better understanding of the changes in chemistry and molecular chemistry that actually happen in, you know, people on different parts of the spectrum, and then accounting for the changes that would end up because of either excessive or lack of particular inhibitory signals or excitatory signals, and then accounting for how they affect different behaviors. In the case of autism, they would be largely psychological. And yeah, I guess to some extent, trying to understand if, you know, one could adjust or accommodate for those differences using, you know, medication or things like that. But I think the models that I have worked with have been largely, you know, a lot of vision-based work. So in those cases, things like autism often don't affect the model too much. But in more psychological studies, I'm sure they have like different models to account for those things. Yeah.
Okay. And any papers? Have you written any papers or thinking about?
I have written a bunch of papers, but unfortunately or fortunately, they don't. They're not very clinically applicable. But I think one of the more fun papers that I'd written was about being able to take small snapshots of the brain and being able to characterize the different kinds of cells that were in the brain, and being able to figure out where exactly in the brain you are seeing a very small snapshot of, seeing a very small picture. The large question sort of that we were trying to answer over there was trying to have an average model of what the average brain looks like, and depending on differences that you see then in the composition of different types of cells, being able to characterize the same across different types of diseases and things like that. Because with things like Alzheimer's or such, you often find that the gray matter of your brain is significantly lesser than what you would find in a normal brain. And so quickly being able to look at small snapshots and being able to judge quite early in time if you're seeing signs of neurodegeneracy or something was the aim of the work done in that paper. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds like good reading also.
Unfortunately, it didn't. Again, it's in the mouse brain.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's true.
All of these things are such. So I mean, that's the other thing. We're barely beginning to scratch the surface. There's so many questions that need to be answered, and the more smart young people there are invested in trying to answer these questions, the more progress we'll make. Yeah,
they'll get there. They'll get there. Anybody have any other questions?
I did have and I don't know if it's a question or I have heard or read either about AI and the ability to write a paper based on a question that you asked this artificial intelligence, be it a database or whatever. But do you see any danger in that area, or like abuse in that area?
Yeah, it's a nuanced question, and the short answer is that yes. Well, there's the question of copyright and things like that, which a lot of people are already concerned with. But more generally, the way these models are trained is to just predict the next word given what it sees previously. And so at this point in time, depending on what your data is that your model is trained on, you could potentially generate questionable material. So there is the danger of generating unsuitable material simply because of the types of questions you were asked. We have very little understanding of exactly how these models work. Like I sort of alluded to it while talking earlier. And yeah, in general, we've gotten to a point where we have this model that has compressed a lot of information on the internet and just responds given whatever question or prompt it receives. And so, yeah, there are questions about copyright. There's questions about whether the material being generated is safe. I think in the next few years, we're going to see a lot more regulation come into these fields. And I think it's probably going to be important to have it too. It's already affecting the types of questions people would ask on a homework, because now if you just ask someone to write 20 lines or a few paragraphs about something, they can just ask ChatGPT to do it for them. But I think that is largely a good thing, I think, because it's going to force us to come up with, types of questions that require people to sit down and think rather than simply write things from memory or stuff like that.
I had never heard of ChatGPT until maybe a month ago. So
Yeah, no, ChatGPT is my best friend now.
Is it? We're just now trying to initiate it at in the group at my job. I'm not sure the folks at AT&T that use it now, but my group started talking about it. And so now that's just one more thing for me to learn, but talk about it a little bit for those that are like me and just now catching on.
So, yeah, ChatGPT is just an instantiation or one type of a large language model. And so the way large language models work are they're built of these, they're built using these models known as deep neural networks. And the way they work is they take in a lot of data and they're trained to essentially just predict the next word given one word or two words or things like that. And it's trained over huge amounts of data, like more data than you and I could possibly, parse in our lifetimes or 10 lifetimes or things like that. It's essentially trained on all of the internet for all intents and purposes. And so now what it's got is it's essentially compressed all these things it's seen on the internet, and it learns to figure out patterns. That's the beauty or the plus of deep neural networks, is that given lots of data, they figure out all these different patterns. And so you could ask ChatGPT to write you a haiku about, I don't know, it's summer now, so cherry blossoms in the summer or something like that, and it will write it for you. You could ask it to write a poem about something, a paragraph about ChatGPT itself, and it probably can do it for you. And yeah, the cool thing is that because we communicate using language, it's essentially given these networks, or these models have learned to talk like you and I do, because it's trained on all of this data, and often these include conversational snippets and things like that. But these models actually have no grounding in reality. So very often, something that a human would understand, like you could very often put in the word not, and that immediately changes the meaning of a sentence, and a human would understand that. But these models often don't quite pick up on those things. And so one needs to be very, very careful about what these models are outputting, because there is no guarantee that what they're saying is correct. For example, I'd asked the model once on purpose. I'd said, I put out 6 shirts to dry in the sun, and it took 6 hours for them to dry. How long would it take for 30 shirts to dry? And it immediately said 30 hours instead of just 6 hours, because it just did the math that, oh, 6 hours, 6 shirts, 1 hour per shirt. But even a child would probably ask, oh, are they all being put out at the same time? Yes. Oh, then it's just going to take 6 hours. So yeah, that's essentially how these models behave right now. They've got a lot of information, but very little common sense. And so, yeah, it's important to be careful about what you're using these models for. Right now, you want to use them for like low stakes tasks, or to have fun generating poems or fun little jokes and things like that. But yeah, a lot of companies are investing a lot of money in getting these models to work better and better so that they can make money off of it. And so it's important to take into account, or it's going to be important to regulate these models, the access that they have to information, and also have rules about how we use the outputs that they generate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So yeah, because I actually was reading, someone had wrote something, and somebody says, it sounds like you use ChatGPT or something. So some things must come out very elementary or weird sounding when folks at the moment use those things, but eventually it's going to get it's just folks just messing around with it now. But you know how 5-10 years from now it's going to be the thing to use.
I'd say, yeah, I'd say like less than 10. I think 5 is probably a better timeline in just normal people using it in everyday life, just like how like smartphones happened. I feel like they're going to become one more thing your phones and your laptops can do for you. Yeah.
Right. I remember working at the phone company. We have people come in all the time to show us new technology, and I recall, I think it may have been maybe 12 years ago, they showed how the smartphones were going to use those, what do you call those, images where somebody's like Star Trek, somebody's talking and you can just see them standing there.
Oh, so like those filters.
Yeah, and instead of you looking at somebody on the phone, it'll be somebody actually standing, the whole body, just standing there talking to you. Just like the movies, right? But it's actually something there that exists today. So it'll be here. It'll be here.
Yeah, and like all of those things. So like your phone being able to unlock if you just show your face, like all of facial recognition, all of those things are deep neural networks. The only difference is that the networks for vision sort of got really good by 2016, 2017, and the ones for language are getting really good now.
Yeah,
So I'd say that, yeah, I'd say there's like a 5-ish year lag very often in when they get really good and when they're just used everywhere. So I'd be prepared to see a lot of these things become very commonplace soon.
definitely, definitely. So anyone else have any questions for Aish? All right. With 5 minutes left, so I really appreciate this conversation and thank you for coming to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and if anybody, she put her this will be on if you guys came through
Yeah.
Eventbrite. She had her information. If you have any further questions, you can email her or the STEM Club, and you can actually review if you came in late. You can review this on our YouTube channel. So Eventbrite has a link. So we're going to post it very shortly. We appreciate you guys taking an hour out of your day to attend this. This was very awesome. It was great information, and I really appreciate the presentation. We thank you, and we always have you come back. So next year, we hope to see you again. So if you change emails or contact information, just let me know so we can find out where you are.
Hopefully, Dr. Aish instead of just Aish. So.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you guys, and